I did not leave just because my 18th birthday was canceled. I walked away the night I realized my childhood was merely a waiting room for my sister's tantrums. What my family never saw coming was that the next morning, I would unlock a fireproof box and unearth a financial secret massive enough to shatter my mother's flawless facade. When the truth detonated, the wreckage was them discovering I was the one person they could no longer underestimate. My name is Joyce Coleman, and I had just turned 18 years old. For most people, that exact number is a golden ticket, a milestone that means freedom, independence, and the sudden, magical arrival of adulthood. For me, it just meant I had successfully survived another agonizing year in the shadow of my family. I was standing behind the heavy oak counter at Blue Lantern Books and Brew, the local independent cafe in the foggy coastal town of Wren Harbor, North Carolina, where I worked part-time. The shop had officially closed to the public exactly 20 minutes ago. The comforting scent of dark roasted espresso beans and ancient, leather-bound paper hung thick in the air, wrapping around my shoulders like a familiar, protective blanket. I was meticulously smoothing out the edges of a cheap plastic tablecloth over the corner booth, making sure the paper napkins and mismatched ceramic plates were perfectly aligned. I did not expect anything luxurious for tonight. There was no rented ballroom, no expensive designer dress, no extravagant catered dinner waiting for me. I just had a simple vanilla sheet cake sitting in the back employee refrigerator, a string of warm yellow fairy lights I had purchased with my own tip money and draped over the main fiction bookshelf, and the modest promise of 5 good friends showing up to sit with me. That was all I wanted. For the first time in my entire existence, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. I felt like I was not standing behind anyone else, waiting for my turn to breathe. It was my night. The industrial espresso machine hissed loudly as it cooled down for the evening, and the quiet streets outside grew even more silent, save for the rhythmic, distant crash of the dark ocean waves against the harbor docks a few blocks away. I wiped my hands on my brown canvas apron, which still bore a fresh, sticky coffee stain near the front pocket, and checked the round analog clock hanging on the exposed brick wall. My friends would be walking through the door in exactly 10 minutes. I felt a rare, delicate spark of genuine happiness fluttering in the center of my chest. Then, my phone violently vibrated against the wooden counter. It was a sharp, aggressive buzz that shattered the calm atmosphere of the empty shop. I picked up the device, fully expecting an excited text message from my best friend saying she was parking her car around the block. Instead, the bright screen lit up with a harsh group text notification from my mother. Meredith Coleman. The message was sent to me, my 5 friends, and my aunt. It was short, cold, and incredibly precise. It stated that the party was canceled immediately due to a severe, unforeseen family emergency. The fragile spark in my chest was instantly extinguished, replaced by a massive, heavy stone of dread dropping straight into the bottom of my stomach. I barely had the time to process the cruel words on the screen before the heavy glass front door of the cafe violently swung open. The brass bell mounted above the frame clanged frantically, a jarring alarm in the quiet space. Meredith marched inside the shop with the posture of an invading general. Right behind her was my older sister, Sloane Coleman. Sloane was 36 years old. Though she dressed, spoke, and acted like someone utterly desperate to maintain the illusion of being in her early 20s. Tonight, however, she was entirely stripped of her usual poised, picture-perfect, social media-ready persona. Her expensive waterproof mascara was thickly smeared down her flushed cheeks. Her high-end silk blouse was horribly wrinkled, and she was sobbing so hysterically that the wet, gasping sounds echoed off the high wooden ceiling of the cafe. This was the severe family emergency. There was no tragic car accident, no sudden trip to the hospital emergency room, no devastating medical diagnosis. It was just another one of Sloane's catastrophic, world-ending emotional breakdowns. "It is entirely gone," Sloane shrieked at the top of her lungs, recklessly throwing her heavy leather designer purse onto a nearby display table, forcefully knocking over a neat stack of promotional bookmarks. He pulled out. The The primary investor completely pulled his funding out of the studio project. He backed out at the absolute last second. I stood completely frozen behind the pastry display case. Sloane had been desperately trying to launch her own exclusive personal beauty brand, Sable House Studio, for the last 3 years. The business venture was a massive, bottomless pit of money, time, and attention, almost all of which was willingly supplied by my mother. The grand launch weekend was supposed to happen in exactly 2 days. "Sweetheart, you need to breathe," Meredith said softly, hovering closely around Sloane like a frantic, dedicated servant. My mother did not even bother to cast a single glance in my direction. She kept her manicured hands firmly on Sloane's shaking shoulders, rubbing them in a continuous, soothing motion. Sloane suddenly spun around on her heels, her swollen, tear-filled eyes locking directly onto me. The overwhelming sadness in her expression instantly hardened into pure, venomous resentment the second she noticed the decorations. "Are you honestly throwing a party?" she demanded, her voice cracking into a shrill, piercing pitch. She stepped aggressively toward the counter, gesturing wildly with trembling hands at the glowing fairy lights and the neatly arranged paper cups. "My entire life is completely falling apart. My launch weekend is utterly ruined. My reputation is destroyed, and you are standing in here setting up for a stupid little birthday party." "It is my 18th birthday, Sloane," I said, my voice incredibly flat, barely rising above a hollow whisper. "I do not care," Sloane screamed, slamming her flat hand against the top of the espresso bar. "If my launch weekend is ruined, you do not deserve to have a happy, carefree celebration. You cannot just sit here and act like everything is perfectly fine and joyful when my entire future has been completely destroyed." I shifted my gaze to my mother, silently waiting for the inevitable defense. I foolishly waited for Meredith to step in and act like a parent. I waited for her to tell Sloane that she was severely overreacting, that they could figure out the investor situation tomorrow morning, that tonight was supposed to be about me for just 2 short hours. Instead, Meredith finally turned her head and met my gaze. Her dark eyes were entirely cold, sharply calculated, and completely devoid of any recognizable maternal warmth. "Joyce," Meredith said, her tone absolutely flat and authoritative, leaving zero room for negotiation. "Take down those cheap lights and pack up your things. We are going home. Right now, we must prioritize the emotional stability of your sister. She is going through a massive crisis. You can easily have a slice of cake next month when things finally settle down." "You canceled my party," I said, the crushing reality of the group text message finally penetrating the shock in my brain. "You actually sent that message to everyone." "I did what I had to do as a mother," Meredith replied smoothly, completely unbothered by the total devastation radiating from my face. "You need to stop being so incredibly selfish and be mature about this situation." But the nightmare was actually much worse than just a hasty group text message. As I instinctively looked down at my glowing phone screen one more time, I saw a direct, private message from my closest friend, Emma. The text read that my mother had not only sent the group message, but had actively taken the time to individually call the parents of my friends. Emma wrote that Meredith had told her mother I was throwing a childish tantrum, that I was being incredibly insensitive to family issues, and that my friends were strictly forbidden from coming over to the cafe. I stopped breathing. The oxygen in the room suddenly felt entirely depleted. Meredith had not just canceled a gathering, she had actively, systematically burned down my support system. She had purposefully called those parents to ensure my friends would be locked in their homes. She had built a massive, impenetrable barricade around my isolation. She assassinated my birthday with her own bare hands, carefully ensuring there would be zero outside witnesses to this domestic cruelty. She expertly manipulated the narrative to make me out to be the ungrateful villain in my own life story. In the single most painful, isolating moment of my entire existence, I did not scream. I did not throw the heavy metal espresso tamper across the room. I did not fall to the floor and cry. Crying was Sloane's designated weapon, and I absolutely refused to use it. The suffocating silence stretched between the three of us, thick, heavy, and undeniably toxic. I turned around without saying a single word and walked over to the fiction bookshelf. I reached up and smoothly unplugged the warm yellow fairy lights from the wall socket. The corner of the shop plunged into dull shadows. I carefully gathered the string of lights along my forearm, one loop at a time, making sure the bulbs stayed still and silent. Then I moved slowly into the back staff room. I stood in the dim light and looked at the vanilla sheet cake sitting peacefully inside the glowing refrigerator. The bright blue icing spelling out my name looked pathetic under the fluorescent bulb. I did not take the box out. I did not cut myself a pity slice. I left it right there in the cold dark, shutting the heavy refrigerator door with a soft thud. I opened my assigned metal locker and pulled out my worn canvas backpack. I slung the heavy strap over my right shoulder and walked back out to the main cafe floor. Meredith and Sloane were still standing in the exact same spot, watching my every move. Sloane was loudly sniffling, clearly waiting for me to apologize to her. She was waiting for me to naturally fold into my permanent, lifelong role as the quiet, accommodating younger sister who absorbed the violent shockwaves of her endless chaos. Meredith had her arms crossed tight against her chest, her posture dictating absolute control. I walked straight past them, keeping my eyes fixed directly on the glass front door. "Joyce, where exactly do you think you are going?" Meredith demanded, her voice suddenly rising in sharp irritation as she realized I was not walking toward her vehicle. "I told you we are going home right now to support your sister." I did not answer her. I pushed my entire body weight against the heavy glass door. The brass bell clanged one final time, a sharp, ringing note of absolute finality bleeding into the quiet night. I stepped out onto the concrete pavement, instantly hit by the damp, salty, freezing air blowing off the dark waters of Wren Harbor. I was still wearing my work uniform, the brown apron with the sticky coffee stain clinging tightly to my chest. I did not have a single wrapped birthday present in my hands. I did not have a cheerful celebration to remember. But as I walked away from the glowing windows of the shop, stepping firmly under the dim, cold, flickering light of the street lamps lining the empty harbor road, a profound, terrifying clarity washed over my entire body. I finally understood the absolute truth. I realized with perfect certainty that if I turned my body around and went back to them this time, if I surrendered and got into the back seat of my mother's car and returned to that suffocating house, the rest of my entire life would be violently taken away from me just like this night was. I would be nothing but disposable fuel meant to keep their fires burning. I tightened my grip on my backpack strap and kept walking directly into the cold dark, leaving everything I had ever known permanently behind me. I did not call a friend for a ride. Instead, I spent $35 of my own hard-earned cash on a local cab to take me across the town limits. The heater in the back of the sedan rattled violently, blowing stale, dusty air against my freezing skin. I watched the familiar coastal roads blur past the smudged window, feeling completely hollowed out. My destination was a modest, weathered cedar shingle house, sitting at the very edge of the pine woods, far away from the manicured lawns of my mother's neighborhood. It belonged to my paternal aunt, Nora Bell. Nora was my late father's older sister. She was a deeply pragmatic, quiet woman who had spent over 30 years working as a county real estate records manager. If there was one thing Nora understood better than anyone else in Wren Harbor, it was the complicated, often ugly ways that desperate families could bury their darkest truths underneath towering piles of legal paperwork. She knew how people lied with deeds, how they manipulated titles, and how they hid their greed behind notarized signatures. When I knocked on her heavy wooden front door just past 10 o'clock at night, she did not ask a single frantic question. She simply took one long, assessing look at my exhausted face, stepped aside, and ushered me into the warm hallway smelling faintly of dried lavender and old wood. She did not pry. She did not force me to sit at her kitchen table and recount the agonizing details of my ruined evening. She possessed a rare, grounding calmness that stood in absolute defiance to the constant, suffocating emotional whirlwinds I was used to surviving at home. Nora gently guided me out the back door and led me up the narrow wooden stairs to the small guest apartment situated directly above her detached garage. The space was incredibly sparse but immaculately clean. It had a sloping roof, a single twin bed pushed against the far wall, and a large window overlooking the dense, dark tree line. The most striking thing about the room was the absolute, pristine silence. There were no shrill voices echoing down the hallway, no shattering glass, no frantic footsteps racing to soothe a manufactured crisis. It was a genuine sanctuary. Nora told me to get some rest and quietly went back down the stairs. Left alone in the quiet chill of the unheated room, I opened the sliding door of the small hallway storage closet to look for an extra blanket. The closet smelled of cedar chips and mothballs. I reached up to the top shelf to pull down a heavy wool quilt, but my hand brushed against something cold and unyielding hidden behind a stack of old towels. I pushed the towels aside. Sitting in the shadows was a heavy, gray, fireproof metal lockbox. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Etched deeply into the small brass plate on the top lid was the name of my father, Daniel Coleman. He had passed away many years ago, leaving behind a massive void that my mother had quickly filled with her own iron-fisted control. Seeing his name suddenly staring back at me in this isolated garage room sent a harsh, electric jolt straight down my spine. I carried the heavy box into the main room and set it down on the mattress. I stared at the combination dial. Before I could even attempt to guess the numbers, I heard the wooden stairs creak outside. Nora walked into the room carrying a mug of hot tea. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the metal box sitting between us on the bed. For a long, tense moment, my aunt did not say a word. She set the mug down on the bedside table and let out a heavy, tired sigh that seemed to carry years of repressed burden. She slowly sat down on the edge of the mattress, refusing to break eye contact with me. Nora admitted that she had been holding on to this specific box since the week of his funeral. She confessed that Daniel had given her strict, undeniable instructions right before his health rapidly declined. He told her that when I finally turned 18 years of age, she was to observe my situation. If things at home felt completely wrong, if my mother and sister were treating me the way he had always secretly feared they would, Nora was legally and morally obligated to give me the box. He wanted me to have the absolute right to read every single document that truly belonged to me. With trembling fingers, Nora reached over and spun the dial, entering a 4-digit code. The heavy metal latch popped open with a loud, metallic click. She stood up, told me to take my time, and softly closed the door behind her, leaving me completely alone with the ghosts of my father's untold secrets. I lifted the heavy lid. The inside of the box smelled like old parchment and stale ink. It was packed tight with thick manila folders. I pulled the first stack out and began spreading the papers across the quilt. There were detailed real estate records, thick piles of education fund statements, and a certified, notarized copy of a complex trust agreement. Sitting squarely in the center of the documents was a crisp, sealed white envelope. Written across the front in my father's familiar, slanted handwriting were the exact words, "Give to Joyce on her 18th birthday." My hands shook violently as I tore the top of the envelope open. I pulled out a single sheet of lined paper. I read the words, and the entire foundation of my understood reality completely dissolved beneath my feet. My father wrote that he loved me deeply. He wrote that he had spent years quietly and deliberately setting aside a specific portion of his personal assets just for his youngest daughter. He explicitly stated that he knew exactly how much space my sister took up in our household, and he wanted to guarantee that I would never, ever have to beg anyone for a chance at my own future. He wanted me to be safe. The sheer weight of his protective foresight made my chest ache. I put the letter down and picked up the largest manila folder. I flipped through the legal jargon until I found a heavily stamped property deed. My eyes scanned the lines of text, struggling to comprehend the information. It was a deed for a small commercial property located directly in the bustling downtown district of Wren Harbor. My mother had repeated a very specific, tragic narrative for my entire life. She always claimed with absolute certainty that she had been forced to sell off every single piece of valuable property my father owned just to pay off his crushing medical debts. She used that story to justify our tight budgets, her endless stress, and the fact that every spare cent always seemed to funnel directly into sustaining Sloane's expensive lifestyle. But the official, legally binding document sitting right in my lap proved that the commercial building had never been sold. It still existed. It was fully paid off, generating consistent monthly leasing revenue, and a significant portion of its ownership rights was legally tied to my name upon reaching the age of adulthood. The medical debt story was a complete, fabricated lie designed to keep me entirely ignorant of my own financial standing. I dug deeper into the folder and found one last item attached to the back of the deed. It was a small, yellow sticky note. The ink was slightly faded, but my father's urgent, frantic handwriting was perfectly legible. The message sent an ice-cold shiver racing straight up the back of my neck. The note commanded me with terrifying precision. It stated that if anyone ever pressured me to sign any document, any waiver, or any transfer form regarding this specific property after I reached the age of 18, I must absolutely refuse. It warned me never to sign my name on the dotted line before making a direct phone call to his trusted estate attorney, Grant Holloway. The instruction was so incredibly specific, so chillingly predictive, that it made the air in the room feel suffocatingly thin. I turned off the single bedside lamp, plunging the small room into total darkness. I sat cross-legged on the mattress, tightly clutching my father's letter against my chest, while the cold ocean wind howled against the window panes outside. The puzzle pieces were violently slamming together in my mind. My mother's cold, calculating eyes demanding I go home with her tonight. The timing of it all happening on the exact day I reached legal adulthood. As I sat there surrounded by the hidden truth, a terrifying realization washed over me. The ruined birthday was never about Sloane crying over a lost investor. That was just convenient, noisy cover. The canceled party was merely the shallow, chaotic surface of a much larger, deeply sinister plan to keep me blind, compliant, and ready to sign my own future away. The next morning arrived with a pale, gray light bleeding through the small window above the garage. I had not slept for a single second. At exactly 6 a.m, I gathered the heavy stacks of paper from my bed, placed them carefully back inside the metal lockbox, and carried it down the wooden stairs to the main house. Nora was already awake, standing quietly by her stove and brewing a large pot of dark roast coffee. She took one look at my exhausted but focused face and wordlessly cleared away the fruit bowl and woven placemats from her large oak dining table. We needed the entire surface area. We were no longer playing family. We were building a timeline. For the first 2 hours, we sat in complete silence, systematically sorting the chaos into distinct, organized categories. We created a pile for educational trust documents, a pile for real estate deeds, a pile for historical tax records, and a thick, damning pile for legal correspondence that had somehow never reached my hands. The slow, methodical process felt less like reading mail and more like conducting an autopsy on my own fabricated childhood. Every single piece of paper was a tiny, sharp blade slowly cutting away the massive curtain of lies my mother had kept draped over my eyes. The first major incision came from the education fund folder. For as long as I could remember, Meredith had drilled a very specific, depressing narrative into my head. She told me repeatedly that my father had died leaving us with nothing but staggering hospital debts, and that my college savings account had been completely drained years ago just to keep our basic household afloat. I had spent my entire high school career agonizing over scholarship applications, working grueling shifts at the cafe, and accepting the fact that higher education would be a massive, crushing financial burden I would have to carry alone. But as I stared down at the crisp bank statements bearing my legal name, the truth stared right back at me. The fund was never empty. It had been incredibly healthy. However, starting around 4 years ago, massive chunks of capital began disappearing. I traced my index finger down the ledger, my blood running colder with every single line item. There was a withdrawal of $12,000 in 2019. There was another withdrawal of $25,000 in 2020. Each of these massive transfers was legally justified under a vague, heavily manipulated category labeled as family development expenses. My mind instantly locked onto the dates. I possessed an excellent memory for the exact timeline of my sister ruining our peace. 2019 was the exact year Sloane decided she needed a professional image coach to revamp her social media presence, demanding expensive wardrobe overhauls and weekend retreats in luxury wellness resorts. 2020 was the year she suddenly pivoted her entire personality, demanding massive amounts of seed money to launch the earliest iteration of her personal beauty brand and paying for a high-end commercial photography team to shoot her promotional material. The realization hit me in the chest with the force of a physical blow. The term family development was nothing but a hollow, sanitized legal shield. There was no family development. There was only Sloane. My mother had actively, purposefully cannibalized my designated future, draining my secure educational foundation to act as a permanent slush fund for my sister and her endless, failing vanity projects. I was never a beloved daughter. I was just a convenient, untapped bank account they used to cover their losses. A wave of sharp, potent nausea washed over me, but I forced myself to swallow it down. I could not afford to be emotional. I reached for the next stack of papers and found a sleek, embossed business card paper-clipped to the front of a trust agreement. It belonged to Grant Holloway, the estate attorney my father had explicitly warned me to contact. I picked up my cell phone, dialed the 10-digit phone number, and held my breath as the line rang. It was barely 9 a.m, but a man with a deep, authoritative voice answered on the second ring. I introduced myself, stating my full name and confirming that I had just turned 18 years old yesterday. I told him I was sitting at a kitchen table looking at a fireproof box that used to belong to Daniel Coleman. I heard a heavy, profound sigh of relief echo through the phone speaker. Grant Holloway told me he had been waiting for this exact phone call for over 5 years. He asked me to look at the commercial real estate deed we had uncovered the night before. I pulled the heavy parchment paper toward me, staring at the property details of the small shophouse located in the downtown commercial district of Wren Harbor. Grant spoke slowly, ensuring I understood every single word. He confirmed that the property had never been sold to pay off any medical debt. It was fully operational, generating steady lease revenue. But then, he delivered the crucial, devastating piece of information that finally connected the entire monstrous puzzle. Grant explained that under the ironclad terms of the trust my father had established, the ownership structure of that specific commercial asset shifted the exact moment I reached legal adulthood. Before yesterday, my mother had managed the property as a custodian, but her power was entirely limited. She could collect the rent, but she could not liquidate the asset. Now that I was 18 years old, any attempt to sell the building, use it as collateral for a bank mortgage, or restructure its ownership required one absolute, undeniable element. It required my valid, legally binding signature on the dotted line. Without my written consent, the property was completely untouchable. I ended the phone call and placed the device face down on the wooden table. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Nora watched me from across the room, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug, waiting for me to speak. My mind violently snapped backward, replaying the events of the last few weeks with terrifying, crystal-clear hindsight. I remembered Meredith standing in our kitchen just 3 days ago, casually pouring herself a glass of red wine. I remembered the exact, nonchalant tone of her voice as she breezily mentioned that we needed to clean up some old filing cabinets soon. She had flashed a tight smile and said there were a few boring, routine insurance papers I needed to sign for her once my birthday passed, framing it as a tedious but necessary chore of becoming an adult. I had nodded blindly, completely trusting the woman who raised me. Suddenly, every single chaotic event from the previous night aligned with sick, perfect logic. The catastrophic meltdown at the cafe was not a random coincidence. Sloane losing her primary investor for her beauty studio meant they were completely out of cash with a massive launch weekend looming just 48 hours away. They were desperate. They needed a massive injection of capital immediately to save the sinking ship, the only asset left in the entire family with enough value to secure that kind of emergency commercial loan was the downtown shophouse. But to use it, my mother needed me to sign away my rights. She did not cancel my 18th birthday party to prioritize the emotional stability of my sister. She canceled it to isolate me. She called the parents of my friends to ensure I had absolutely no one to talk to, no outside perspectives to rely on, and no joy to anchor me. She needed to break my spirit, drag me back to that suffocating house, and keep me under her absolute, terrifying control. She needed me exhausted, compliant, and conditioned to do exactly what I was told, so that when she slid those completely fraudulent insurance papers across the table this morning, I would sign away my entire inheritance without asking a single question. My birthday was slaughtered to soften me up for a financial execution. I looked down at the documents spread across the table. For 18 years, I had walked through my life feeling like a vague, invisible victim, constantly confused by why I was never quite enough, why I always had to shrink myself to make room for my sister. I thought my suffering was just a tragic, unexplainable family dynamic. But as I sat there in the quiet morning light, staring at the exact dollar amount stolen from my education, and understanding the calculated, predatory nature of my ruined celebration, the confusion permanently evaporated. I was not a victim of circumstance. I was the target of a deliberate, long-term financial crime orchestrated by my own mother. For the very first time in my life, I had a concrete, undeniable truth to hold on to, and its edges were sharper than any knife they could ever try to use against me. The soft, mechanical chime of the laptop speaker shattered the heavy silence in the kitchen. Grant Holloway had just sent a secure email containing a massive digital file. Nora poured me a fresh cup of coffee, her movements deliberate and steady. As I reached out and clicked the download button, a thick, scanned document filled the entire screen. It was the comprehensive communication log from his law firm, a meticulous, chronological record of every single piece of correspondence they had ever attempted to send to my residential address over the past several years. I scrolled slowly down the page, my eyes scanning the endless rows of dates and formal subject lines. There were tax notices, annual trust updates, and requests for guardian signatures. My mother had been the absolute, undisputed gatekeeper of our brass mailbox. She sorted the mail every single afternoon before I ever returned home from high school. I kept scrolling until my finger froze on the trackpad. There was a specific, highly important letter dated exactly 6 months before my 18th birthday. Grant had sent a formal, physical invitation addressed directly to me, requesting an in-person meeting at his downtown office. The letter explicitly stated that the purpose of the meeting was to prepare me for the legal transfer of my commercial property rights and to explain the exact parameters of my incoming financial independence. I stared at the glowing pixels on the screen, feeling a cold, suffocating wave of pure disgust wash over my chest. My mother had intercepted that exact letter. She held that thick, watermarked envelope in her manicured hands, sliced it open, read every single word about my impending freedom, and then threw it straight into the garbage. She had looked me directly in the eyes at the dinner table that very same evening, calmly sipping her sparkling water, and casually repeated her favorite, tragic lie. She told me again that my father was a careless man who died leaving us with absolutely nothing but a mountain of suffocating medical debt. She actively fed me that poison while holding the undeniable proof of my wealth behind her back. But the depth of the betrayal did not stop at stolen mail. My phone vibrated against the wooden table. Grant was calling back. I put him on speakerphone. His voice was grim, devoid of any professional pleasantries. He instructed me to scroll down to page 42 of the digital file. He said his paralegal had noticed something deeply concerning during the routine audit of my file that morning. I dragged the cursor down. The page displayed a standard legal acknowledgement form regarding the temporary continuation of property management. At the very bottom of the document, resting neatly on the dotted line, was a signature. It spelled my full legal name. I stopped breathing. The ink on the screen looked exactly like my handwriting, but I had never seen that piece of paper in my entire life. I had never held a pen to that document. Nora leaned closely over my shoulder, her eyes narrowing into sharp, focused slits as she studied the screen. Without saying a single word, she turned around, walked out of the kitchen, and went straight into the hallway closet. She returned a moment later carrying a small, dusty cardboard box filled with old family keepsakes. She rummaged through the stacks of paper until she pulled out a faded, handmade birthday card I had drawn for her during my sophomore year of high school. Nora placed the old card directly next to the glowing laptop screen. The two signatures sat side by side, exposed in the harsh morning light. We leaned in and compared the ink. At first glance, it was a terrifyingly perfect match. The sharp, aggressive slant of the letter J was there. The heavy, exaggerated bottom loop of the letter Y was perfectly replicated, but as I stared longer, the horrifying truth began to reveal itself. The signature on the legal form was entirely devoid of natural rhythm. When I sign my name, the pen moves fast, creating light, fluid strokes that fade slightly at the end of the word. The ink on the scanned document was thick, dark, and perfectly uniform. The pressure of the pen was heavy and painfully slow. "This is not a spontaneous fake," Nora whispered, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "This is a calculated tracing. Someone sat down at a desk, looked at a sample of your handwriting, and practiced this over and over again until they got it right." A deeply buried memory violently erupted in my mind, hitting me with the force of a physical blow. I was 15 years old, sitting at the kitchen island trying to finish my chemistry homework. Sloane was sitting across from me, holding a blue ballpoint pen. She was casually doodling on a scrap piece of paper. She looked over at my open notebook, smirked, and began copying my name. She laughed her sharp, condescending laugh and confidently declared that she could forge my handwriting much better than the original author ever could. I had brushed it off back then as just another strange, annoying habit of an older sister who constantly needed to prove she was superior at absolutely everything. I thought it was just a meaningless sibling joke. Now, the memory made my blood run absolutely cold. It was never a joke. It was a rehearsal. My sister and my mother had turned the theft of my legal identity into a casual domestic activity. Sloane was not just a passive beneficiary of my mother stealing my future. She was an active, willing participant in the fraud. They had sat together in the comfort of our home, treating my name and my rights like a fun, disposable resource they could manipulate whenever they needed more cash for another failed business venture. I pushed my chair back from the table, my hands trembling with a sudden, overwhelming surge of adrenaline. I turned my attention back to the heavy metal lockbox sitting near the fruit bowl. I had emptied the main folders earlier, but as I looked down into the dark metal casing, I noticed a slight separation in the lining at the very bottom. I reached in and pulled up the thin felt divider. Hidden underneath was a thick, sealed brown envelope. I tore the top open. Inside were 5 smaller, individual white envelopes. They were all addressed to me, written in my father's distinct, slanted handwriting. The first envelope read for Joyce on her 13th birthday. The next one read for her 14th birthday. They continued in perfect sequential order, ending with a letter meant for my 17th birthday. My hands shook violently as I opened the very first envelope. I pulled out a single sheet of lined paper. My father wrote about how incredibly proud he was of my quiet strength. He wrote about his deep hopes for my education and his unwavering belief in my ability to build a beautiful, independent life. I tore open the second letter. The sentiment was exactly the same. The pages were filled with pure, unadulterated love, profound respect, and a fierce, protective belief in my potential. The realization struck me with a devastating, agonizing clarity. The pain was no longer just about numbers on a bank statement. My mother did not just steal my money. She systematically withheld the absolute proof that I was loved. For 5 years, I had walked through that house feeling entirely alone, feeling like a heavy, unwanted burden left behind by a careless man. I had spent my entire adolescence believing that my father had abandoned me to a life of serving Sloane, leaving me with nothing to my name. My mother knew these letters existed. She held the evidence of his love in her hands, and she consciously chose to hide it from me. She deliberately starved me of affection and confidence so that I would remain weak, isolated, and permanently dependent on her approval. I carefully folded the fragile letters and placed them back inside their envelopes. I did not cry. The tears I had refused to shed at the cafe the night before were completely gone, burned away by a hot, blinding rage that settled deep into my bones. I looked at Nora, and then I looked back at the glowing screen displaying the forged signature. The confusing, messy hurt of a neglected child had completely vanished. In its place stood the sharp, focused, entirely rational pain of an adult who had just been handed the documented proof of a massive betrayal. The ruined birthday party felt so incredibly small and insignificant now. The unlit fairy lights and the untouched vanilla cake left in the cafe refrigerator were entirely irrelevant. I was no longer fighting to demand a simple apology for a stolen evening. As I sat there surrounded by the undeniable evidence of their crimes, I knew exactly what had to be done. I was going to fight to completely reclaim a life that had been quietly held in custody and maliciously used against me, and I was going to make sure they paid for every single stolen year. My phone vibrated aggressively against the solid oak surface of Nora's kitchen table, the harsh buzzing sound cutting sharply through the quiet morning air. I watched the rectangular device slowly inch its way toward the wooden edge with every incoming notification. I reached out and tapped the glass screen. Meredith had finally woken up, walked past my bedroom, and discovered that I had never returned home last night. The rapid succession of text messages flooding my screen was a terrifying, brilliant masterclass in psychological manipulation. The first 3 messages were drenched in a sickening manufactured sweetness. She called me her precious girl, begging me to just come home so we could talk things out over a hot cup of tea. She typed that she was worried sick about my safety out in the cold. But when 5 minutes passed, and I did not immediately offer a submissive reply, her tone violently fractured. The maternal warmth vanished, instantly replaced by sharp, demanding hostility and thinly veiled threats. The subsequent texts ordered me to stop acting like a spoiled brat. She warned me that I was making a massive fool of myself and explicitly commanded me not to make things any uglier before we sat down to sign the necessary family papers this afternoon. She actually typed the words "family papers," casually disguising the theft of my entire financial future as a simple, mundane household chore. I did not type a single letter in response. I did not justify my absence or demand an apology for the ruined evening at the cafe. Instead, I methodically pressed the side buttons on my device, capturing a clear digital screenshot of every single manipulative word she sent. For the very first time in my entire existence, I stepped completely out of the ring. I allowed my mother to speak into an absolute void, stripping her of the power to define the narrative of my own life. Right on cue, a new text bubble popped up. It was Sloane. Her messages were entirely devoid of any fake parental concern. They were purely transactional, dripping with venom and frantic desperation. She did not offer a single syllable of remorse for screaming at me on my 18th birthday. She aggressively accused me of purposefully sabotaging the absolute last chance to rescue Sable House Studio. She typed in furious, capitalized bursts, claiming that my sudden disappearance was destroying a critical business deal that the entire family had poured their blood, sweat, and tears into securing. Before I could process the sheer audacity of her blame, Grant Holloway called my phone again. I accepted the call and placed him on speakerphone. Grant did not offer any polite morning greetings. He had spent the last 2 hours aggressively digging into the county commercial registry and making highly discreet phone calls to his professional contacts at the local lending institutions. He had uncovered the exact, terrifying mechanics of their trap. Meredith was not simply trying to sell the downtown property. The real estate market was far too slow for their immediate crisis. Instead, she was in the middle of a frantic, highly expedited legal process to use the building as direct collateral to secure a massive commercial bridge loan. That specific loan was the exact dollar amount required to replace the primary private investor who had suddenly backed out of Sloane's beauty studio project just 24 hours ago. Meredith had already drafted the paperwork with a private equity firm. The only thing missing to finalize the desperate cash grab was the legal signature of the newly minted adult owner. The puzzle clicked together with sickening perfection. My birthday was never sacrificed to gently soothe the fragile, overwhelming emotions of a stressed older sister. It was a calculated, necessary execution. They needed me utterly defeated, isolated from my friends, and desperate for their basic approval so that I would blindly sign those collateral agreement forms today without asking a single question. They did not see me as a sister or a daughter. They saw me as a compliant, easily manipulated hostage required to close a high-stakes commercial transaction. A younger, slightly more reckless version of myself might have reacted differently. I felt a powerful, surging urge to grab my phone, open a social media application, and start a live video broadcast. The desire to scream the raw truth into the internet, to publicly expose their endless greed to every single person we knew in Wren Harbor, was undeniably intoxicating. But I forced myself to take a deep, stabilizing breath. I knew exactly how that impulsive scenario would end. Meredith was a master of public relations. If I posted a tearful video online, she would effortlessly spin my raw pain into definitive proof of my mental instability. She would look into a camera, put on her best concerned mother face, and paint me as a hysterical, ungrateful teenager acting out for cheap attention. I absolutely refused to hand her the exact weapon she needed to discredit me. I was not going to be a messy, easily dismissed internet headline. I was going to be a silent, unstoppable legal nightmare. I looked across the table at Nora, who gave me a firm, understanding nod. Together with Grant on the phone, we shifted our entire focus from emotional survival to ruthless strategy. We began building a physical fortress out of paper. We did not rely on feelings or accusations. We relied on hard, indisputable evidence. We compiled a master dossier. We carefully organized the hidden birthday letters my father had written, the bank statements proving the systematic, unauthorized draining of my designated education fund, the comprehensive legal log of intercepted mail, the county forms bearing my heavily forged handwriting, and the freshly printed screenshots of Meredith actively pressuring me to sign over my property rights. It was a flawless, airtight portfolio of fiduciary abuse and calculated fraud. As we placed the final document into a thick leather binder, Nora stood up and walked over to the small desk in the corner of her living room. She returned a moment later and slid a heavy, glossy cardstock envelope across the kitchen table. It had arrived in her mailbox roughly 2 weeks prior. I opened the elegant gold flap and pulled out a beautifully embossed invitation. The Alder Vale Civic Group, the most elite and influential organization in the entire coastal region, was hosting their prestigious annual charity gala this upcoming weekend. Right in the center of the heavy paper, printed in bold, elegant typography, was the announcement for their highest annual honor. Meredith was officially scheduled to be crowned the Civic Mother of the Year. I stared at the invitation, feeling a cold, sharp laugh rising in the back of my throat. The entire local community, the wealthy regional donors, the politicians, and the local press were all gathering in one massive ballroom to publicly celebrate her carefully crafted, entirely fictitious image. She had spent over a decade selling Wren Harbor, the inspiring, heartbreaking story of a brave, selfless widow who sacrificed absolutely everything she had to single-handedly build a beautiful, secure future for her 2 fatherless daughters. It was the exact lie she used to garner endless sympathy, secure unearned business favors for Sloane, and maintain her iron grip on our elevated social standing. I traced my finger over her printed name. A slow, chilling realization washed through my veins. I had spent my entire childhood watching my mother expertly use her flawless public reputation as an impenetrable shield and a heavy weapon against anyone who dared to question her authority. She cared about what the wealthy elites of this town thought of her far more than she ever cared about my actual life. Fate had just handed me the ultimate, devastating advantage. I did not need to scream my truth into the void of the internet. I did not need to cry or beg anyone to believe me. I just needed to take this binder of absolute truth and walk directly onto the exact, brightly lit stage she had meticulously built to control everyone else. The clock hanging on the wall of Nora's kitchen was relentlessly ticking down toward noon when Grant Holloway finally dropped the heavy legal hammer. Moving with the aggressive, merciless speed of a seasoned corporate litigator, he filed a severe emergency injunction with the county clerk to freeze any and all transactions regarding my commercial shophouse. Simultaneously, his office dispatched a formal, highly aggressive cease and desist warning directly to the executive branch of the primary escrow company handling my mother's fraudulent collateral loan. He executed this precise legal strike a mere 2 hours before Meredith was scheduled to sit in a plush leather chair, smile her charming smile, and officially sign away my entire future. The immediate financial fallout was spectacular, chaotic, and incredibly violent. My cellular phone screen instantly transformed into a frantic, blinding strobe light of missed communications. My mother abandoned her sickly sweet, deeply concerned parent routine entirely. The mask slipped, and the desperate predator underneath lunged forward. She dialed my number over 24 times in the span of 45 minutes, her text messages devolving from manipulative pleas into pure, unhinged rage. When I finally decided to answer the 25th call, I did not even get the chance to breathe a single word of greeting. Meredith screamed into the receiver with a raw, guttural ferocity I had never heard before in my entire life. Her voice was completely stripped of all its usual refined country club polish and delicate grace. She shrieked that the escrow agent had just frozen the master account and that the private equity firm was aggressively backing away from the negotiation table. She demanded to know what kind of vicious lies I had told Grant Holloway, aggressively accusing me of maliciously destroying the single greatest, life-altering opportunity her oldest daughter had ever received. She painted me as a jealous, spiteful child, intentionally ruining our family legacy. I sat perfectly still at the wooden table. My heart beat with a steady, icy rhythm that felt entirely foreign to me. For 18 years, I had quietly absorbed her anger. I had constantly folded myself into smaller and smaller shapes just to avoid setting off these exact explosions. But sitting there, staring at the undeniable, printed proof of her financial treason resting right in front of me, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, terrifying clarity. I spoke quietly into the phone, my voice completely devoid of any trembling apology or familiar submission. I told her that if Sloane's massive business opportunity could only exist by secretly stealing real estate from someone else without their explicit permission, then it was never a legitimate opportunity at all. I told her it was simply theft, wearing very expensive makeup. Meredith gasped loudly, the sharp, shocked intake of breath echoing loudly over the speaker. She had never heard me speak to her with such absolute, unwavering defiance. Before she could recover her footing and launch into another tyrannical, guilt-inducing tirade, I firmly pressed the red button to end the call and permanently blocked her number from my device. The domino effect of Grant blocking the emergency collateral loan was swift and financially devastating. By mid-afternoon, the shockwaves of the frozen assets had reached the primary financial backers of Sable House Studio. The sudden, unexplained failure of the collateral agreement caused the remaining, highly skeptical investors to panic. They immediately demanded a comprehensive, merciless forensic review of the entire family capital contribution history before they would proceed with funding the grand launch weekend. This brutal, unexpected audit violently ripped the protective cover off the massive financial sinkholes Meredith had spent years desperately trying to hide. The investors quickly discovered that the highly touted beauty brand was essentially a hollow, glittering shell. They saw that it was built entirely on heavily leveraged personal debt and my deliberately drained education funds rather than legitimate, sustainable business revenue. The fragile, toxic ecosystem of lies my mother had carefully constructed to protect Sloane from the real world began completely collapsing in real time. The sheer panic of the impending bankruptcy instantly turned them against each other like starving animals. Sloane, realizing her entire vanity project and social identity were actively dying, completely turned her wrath on the woman who had enabled her for decades. According to a frantic, heavily capitalized text message Sloane sent me later that evening, she viciously blamed Meredith for the entire disaster. Sloane angrily wrote that Meredith had confidently promised the money was fully secured and ready to wire. My sister typed that our mother had sworn up and down that I would just blindly sign the legal papers because I always yielded, because I always surrendered my own needs just to keep the peace in the house. In return, Meredith desperately tried to shift the entire crushing burden of blame back onto my shoulders. She sent Nora a massive, rambling electronic mail, bitterly complaining that her ungrateful, rebellious youngest daughter was actively choosing to tear the entire family apart just to spite them over a single, insignificant birthday party. They were trapped together in a sinking ship of their own making, rapidly taking on water, yet they were still wasting their final breath screaming about who forgot to bring a life jacket. Then, my phone buzzed with a direct message from Emma, my closest friend who had been banned from the cafe. She had been driving past the downtown business district and noticed a highly unusual, disturbing scene. She sent me a blurry photograph taken hastily from the driver's seat of her vehicle. The image displayed on my screen showed Meredith and Sloane standing right in the middle of the open concrete parking lot of the luxury escrow office. They were visibly engaged in a vicious, highly aggressive screaming argument right on the hot asphalt. Sloane was wildly gesturing with her arms, her face contorted in pure, ugly rage, while Meredith gripped her expensive leather purse so tightly her knuckles appeared bone white. Several well-dressed pedestrians and local business owners were actively stopping on the public sidewalk to openly stare at the shocking commotion. The flawless, untouchable, perfectly curated mask of the ideal Wren Harbor family had violently cracked wide open for the entire town to witness. I stared at the digital photograph for a very long time, zooming in on their distorted faces. An undeniable, heavy ache settled deep within my chest. It was the distinct, mourning pain of a child finally accepting that she never truly had a loving family at all. But despite the dull ache throbbing in my ribs, I did not soften. My resolve did not waver for a single fleeting second. I looked at their angry, panicked expressions and finally understood the absolute truth of my existence. The Coleman family was not imploding because I had walked out of the coffee shop 2 nights ago. They were not suffering because I was being cruel. They were rapidly collapsing because they had built their entire world, their entire financial structure, on the arrogant, fundamental assumption that I would remain completely silent forever. I was the structural, load-bearing pillar of their grand delusions, and I had simply chosen to step aside and let gravity do its job. Grant Holloway arrived back at Nora's house right as the sun began to set heavily over the dark pine woods, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. He carried a fresh stack of thick manila folders, his expression incredibly serious and sharply focused. He sat down across from me, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and folded his hands deliberately on the table. He looked me directly in the eyes and delivered a powerful statement that fundamentally shifted the entire battlefield from a defensive stance to an offensive war. He explained that the emergency injunction was highly successful, and the commercial property was completely secure from any immediate liquidation. However, he carefully noted that based on the extensive forged documents, the intercepted legal mail, and the deliberately drained educational trust accounts we had uncovered that morning, we had crossed a massive, undeniable legal threshold. Grant told me with chilling professionalism that if I truly wanted to press forward, this situation was no longer just a simple matter of blocking a shady real estate sale to protect a building. He leaned in closer and stated that we now possessed the definitive, ironclad evidence required to file a massive, devastating civil lawsuit against my own mother for a severe breach of fiduciary duty and intentional financial fraud. He laid the ultimate choice directly at my feet, the weight of the pending destruction hanging heavy in the quiet room, asking me if I was finally ready to stop playing defense and tear their entire empire down to the ground. I sat at the sturdy oak dining table, carefully filling out the dense financial verification forms our attorney had left behind. The clock on the wall read 3 in the afternoon. The quiet, methodical rhythm of my pen scratching against the thick paper was abruptly shattered by a series of frantic, heavy knocks on the solid wood of the front door. My aunt had gone to the county clerk office, leaving me entirely alone in the house. I walked down the narrow hallway and pulled the heavy door open. Standing on the porch, trembling in the damp coastal wind, was my older sister. She looked absolutely unrecognizable. The glossy, perfectly curated armor she wore every single day was completely gone. Her expensive hair extensions were tangled and frizzy from the coastal humidity, and her face was pale, utterly devoid of the luminous foundation she usually plastered on to face the world. She looked deeply exhausted, hollowed out, and radiating a bitter, toxic energy. She pushed past me without waiting for a polite invitation, marching straight into the kitchen and dropping her body heavily into one of the wooden chairs. I closed the door and slowly walked back, taking a seat directly across from her. For a long, tense moment, we simply stared at each other in the quiet room. Then, her deeply ingrained defensive instincts kicked in, and she immediately resorted to her classic, condescending tone. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and sneered. She told me I was taking things entirely too far. She aggressively accused me of dragging lawyers into a simple family disagreement just because I had harbored a pathetic, deep-seated jealousy toward her since we were little girls. She claimed I was using my canceled party as a pathetic excuse to finally ruin her life out of sheer spite, trying to actively punish her for being the one with actual ambition and talent. Her voice was shrill, desperate to frame me as the bitter, unstable villain of our family story. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic pitch. I did not waste my breath defending my character against her delusions. Instead, I calmly reached over to the neatly organized leather binder sitting on the corner of the table. I opened the thick cover and pulled out 2 very specific items. First, I placed the clear plastic sleeve containing the legal document with the meticulously forged signature squarely in front of her. Next to it, I gently laid down the 5 sealed envelopes, the unread birthday letters our father had painstakingly written for me. I slid them across the smooth wooden surface until they touched her trembling fingertips. She looked down. The aggressive, arrogant posture she had carried into the room instantly fractured into a million pieces. I watched the color rapidly drain from her already pale cheeks as her eyes darted frantically between the clumsy replication of my handwriting and the familiar, slanted script of the man who used to read us bedtime stories. The silence in the kitchen grew so heavy it felt entirely suffocating. Her breathing turned shallow and erratic, the venomous, untouchable older sister routine completely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal. Then, she spoke, her voice dropping into a hoarse, ragged whisper. She confessed a truth that cut far deeper than any stolen bank balance ever could. She admitted that several months ago, long before the catastrophic night at the coffee shop, she had been digging through the master filing cabinet in our mother's home office looking for old tax receipts. During her frantic search, she had stumbled upon the hidden fireproof box. She found the thick envelope bearing my name. She opened it. She read the first few paragraphs of our father's letter, the exact lines where he explicitly detailed my secure financial future and my legal rights to the commercial property. I sat perfectly still, my blood turning to absolute ice in my veins. She continued her brutal confession, the ugly words tumbling out of her mouth in a rapid, shameful stream. She said that the exact moment she realized I held the ultimate power over the only asset that could save her failing beauty studio, she panicked. Instead of telling me the truth, instead of handing me the letter that rightfully belonged to me, she shoved it back into the hidden box and slammed the heavy metal box shut. She intentionally kept her mouth sealed. That horrifying admission meant that for months, every single time she looked me in the eyes, every time she demanded massive amounts of money from our mother, and every time she treated me like a disposable servant, she already knew she was actively surviving on my stolen, delayed future. The ultimate betrayal was not a sudden act of financial desperation. It was a prolonged, conscious choice to consume my life to artificially inflate hers. I asked her how she could possibly justify looking at me every single day, knowing exactly what she had done in the dark. She wiped a frantic tear from her cheek and offered the most chilling, perfectly programmed defense I had ever heard. She looked up at me with desperate, pleading eyes and repeated the exact toxic doctrine our mother had relentlessly drilled into her brain since early childhood. She said that our mother always taught her a very specific rule regarding our family dynamic. The rule dictated that whoever shined the brightest, whoever had the most visible potential to elevate the family name and secure social status, fundamentally deserved the vast majority of the investments and resources. She swallowed hard and told me that our mother always described me as incredibly stable, highly capable of enduring hardship, and someone who simply did not need very much to survive. Hearing those exact words spoken out loud in the quiet kitchen made my skin crawl. It was a terrifying, perfect summary of my entire existence in that house, compacted into a single, highly unjust academic theory. My quiet resilience, my ability to handle my own problems without screaming for constant attention, was never viewed as a positive strength to be celebrated or nurtured. It was actively weaponized against me. They looked at my independence and decided it was an open invitation to permanently neglect me. They transformed my ability to endure their endless chaos into a twisted, unfair doctrine that easily justified stripping me of my own resources. I was the sturdy, invisible foundation they felt completely comfortable destroying just to build her a taller, prettier tower. Suddenly, she broke. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep violently. The sound was not her usual performative, weaponized crying meant to manipulate a sympathetic audience. It was a raw, ugly, deeply pathetic sound of total, undeniable collapse. She sobbed because the terrifying reality of her own existence had finally crushed her. She realized in that exact moment that if she stripped away the massive financial scaffolding our mother had illegally built underneath her, she had absolutely nothing left. She had no real business acumen, no genuine independence, and no authentic identity whatsoever. She was nothing more than a pampered, heavily funded project created by a deeply narcissistic parent. The grand illusion of her inherent superiority was completely dead. I sat across from my sobbing sister and felt a profound, echoing emptiness wash over my chest. A part of me, the deeply ingrained, intensely conditioned younger sister, felt the familiar muscle memory urging me to stand up, walk around the wooden table, and wrap my arms tightly around her shaking shoulders. I felt the phantom, historical urge to comfort her, to pat her back, and assure her that everything would somehow magically be okay. But I did not move a single muscle. I did not offer her a tissue to wipe her face. I did not utter a single word of forgiveness, understanding, or absolution. I sat back in my chair, staring at her crumbling form, and realized a fundamental truth about my own power. The absolute strongest retaliation I could ever inflict upon her was not to scream in her face, curse her name, or actively try to make her disappear from the town. The most devastating, permanent revenge was simply refusing to clean up her mess. It was stepping completely out of her way, permanently withdrawing my role as her emotional punching bag, and forcing everyone in our lives to clearly, undeniably witness the grotesque, hollow system that had created her in the first place. The thick, heavy envelope arrived at the front door of Nora's house precisely at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, delivered by a private legal courier. It was sealed with a stiff, formal adhesive strip and bore the return address of a highly expensive corporate law firm located in the wealthy financial district. I carried the package into the kitchen, slid a butter knife under the flap, and pulled out a stack of crisp, watermarked paper. It was an official settlement proposal drafted entirely by Meredith. I spread the pages across the wooden table and read through the clauses. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the document was truly breathtaking. Meredith was offering a financial compromise, but it was disguised as an act of profound maternal grace. The terms stated that she would willingly return exactly 30% of the capital she had drained from my educational trust. She also promised to completely cover the tuition costs for my first year of university. The document explicitly demanded that we keep this unfortunate misunderstanding strictly within the boundaries of the family. However, the true purpose of the proposal was buried in the aggressive conditions attached to the final page. In exchange for this pathetic fraction of my own money, I was required to sign a massive, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. I had to permanently drop any and all threats of civil litigation against her. But the most revealing condition of all was a highly specific clause dictating my physical location for the upcoming weekend. The contract explicitly forbade me from attending or appearing anywhere near the Aldervale Civic Group charity gala. Grant Holloway arrived an hour later, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and meticulously reviewed the paperwork. He tapped his pen against the dense paragraphs and let out a dry, humorless laugh. He pointed out the deceptive, slippery language heavily woven throughout the document. The contract deliberately referred to the stolen trust money as flexible household capital reallocation rather than admitting to blatant financial fraud. It was carefully engineered to completely erase any actual legal or fiduciary liability on her part. Grant looked across the table and explained the true strategy behind the paper. He told me that this document was not a genuine surrender or an admission of guilt. It was a desperate, calculated purchase. Meredith knew the massive storm was rapidly approaching. She was simply trying to buy my absolute silence for pennies on the dollar right before she stepped onto a public stage to have her flawless moral reputation officially stamped and validated by the entire coastal community. She wanted to lock me in a legal cage before I could ruin her crowning achievement. I felt a brief, familiar flash of hot anger rising in my chest, a sudden urge to tear the thick paper into tiny shreds and mail them directly back to her pristine house. But before I could act on that defensive impulse, Nora placed a gentle, grounding hand over mine. My aunt offered a masterclass in quiet, lethal patience. She spoke with the steady, unshakable calm of a woman who had spent decades observing the fatal mistakes of arrogant people. She advised me not to respond with a short-term, explosive burst of emotion. A loud, messy rejection would only signal to Meredith that I was still operating on pure anger, making me entirely predictable. Nora looked deeply into my eyes and reminded me of a harsh truth. She said that if I had already successfully endured 18 years of constant emotional starvation, psychological manipulation, and forced submission, I possessed more than enough strength to wait just 3 more days. She told me to hold my ground, keep my hands perfectly clean, and wait for the exact moment to deliver the final blow by placing the absolute truth in the most devastating location possible. I absorbed her wisdom, letting the hot anger cool into a sharp, frozen resolve. I made a deliberate choice to pivot my strategy. I did not sign the fraudulent settlement agreement, nor did I send a fiery, dramatic rejection letter demanding justice. Instead, I sent a very brief, incredibly polite text message directly to my mother. I typed that I needed more time to review the complex legal jargon and would not be signing any binding papers this week. However, I explicitly confirmed that I would be quietly attending the charity event on Saturday evening to show my respectful support for the family name. It was a brilliant, highly deceptive maneuver. My mother, completely blinded by her own lifelong assumptions about my character, instantly interpreted my polite, non-confrontational response as a massive victory. In her deeply arrogant mind, my delay on the paperwork meant absolutely nothing as long as I promised to show up and play my designated role as the quiet, obedient, perfectly behaved background prop. She falsely assumed that her aggressive legal threats had successfully terrified me, and that I was finally backing down out of a deep-seated fear of ruining our pristine public image. She believed I had softened, retreating to my comfortable position in her shadow. While Meredith spent the next 48 hours aggressively celebrating her perceived victory, coordinating her expensive hair appointments, and ignoring the collapsing reality around her, we were moving in absolute silence. Grant was meticulously orchestrating a flawless legal masterpiece behind closed doors. He finalized the ultimate, undeniable dossier. The heavy black binder now contained a formally drafted petition requesting a superior court judge to immediately appoint an independent, third-party receiver to seize total control of my commercial property and freeze all associated accounts. It held the irrefutable, physical proof of her severe breach of fiduciary trust, the chronological log of the intercepted mail, the forged county documents, and the completely fabricated financial disclosure statements she had illegally used to trick the local private equity firm. The weapon was fully loaded, the safety was off, and it was perfectly primed to fire. Later that evening, I walked upstairs to my small room above the garage to prepare my armor. I opened my worn canvas backpack and pulled out the single item of nice clothing I had hastily packed on the night I walked away from my old life. It was a simple, dark navy blue linen dress. It was completely unpretentious, entirely devoid of any expensive designer labels, flashy sequins, or dramatic flair. It was the exact, modest dress I had planned to wear to my ruined 18th birthday celebration at the coffee shop. Choosing to wear that specific garment to the most elite, heavily photographed social event of the year was a deliberate, silent declaration of war. I wanted the memory of that stolen, traumatizing night to serve as the absolute center of gravity for her impending destruction. I was going to carry the ghost of the birthday she murdered right into the center of her greatest triumph. The final, fatal piece of intelligence arrived the following afternoon. Nora received a highly discreet phone call from a trusted former colleague who currently served on the executive planning board for the Alder Vale Civic Group. The committee member, completely unaware of the raging war inside our family, casually leaked a crucial detail regarding the upcoming ceremony schedule. She revealed that Meredith had excitedly submitted an advance copy of her acceptance speech for the production team to load into the teleprompter. My mother was planning to stand under the bright, focused stage lights and deliver a deeply emotional, carefully rehearsed monologue. She intended to tell the wealthy donors the inspiring story of how she single-handedly steered our grieving family through the dark, treacherous waters following the tragic death of my father. The grand finale of her speech, the exact line designed to guarantee a standing ovation, was a passionate, tearful claim that she had sacrificed equally for both of her beloved daughters, loving us with perfect, undivided parity. When Nora quietly relayed that specific detail to me, I sat on the edge of the mattress and smiled. It was the very first time I had smiled in many days. It was not a smile born of joy, relief, or happiness. It was the cold, terrifying, deeply satisfied smile of someone watching a highly arrogant predator willingly step directly into a steel trap. I fully understood the magnificent, poetic irony of the approaching evening. My mother was completely obsessed with climbing to the absolute highest social pedestal in Wren Harbor. She had spent a decade building a massive, glittering tower of lies just to reach that specific stage. I realized I did not need to scream, push, or fight her for the spotlight. She was eagerly, blindly climbing up the ladder all by herself, totally unaware that I was standing quietly in the shadows at the very bottom, holding the irrefutable truth that would shatter the foundation beneath her feet. The Calder House Ballroom was a towering monument to old money, carefully guarded social hierarchies, and the intoxicating power of flawless public relations. The historic venue sat at the highest elevation point in Wren Harbor, its massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark, crashing waves of the coastline below. Inside, the grand hall was a masterclass in suffocating opulence. Heavy crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant, blinding golden light over a sprawling sea of expensive silk evening gowns, tailored velvet tuxedos, and blinding diamond jewelry. The most influential figures in the entire regional district had gathered together in one room. There were wealthy local politicians, highly connected corporate sponsors, and a massive swarm of regional journalists carrying heavy cameras. They had all purchased expensive tables and donned their absolute best attire for one singular, unified purpose. They were here to publicly honor and elevate Meredith as the inspiring, undisputed face of female sacrifice in our community. I arrived at the main entrance exactly at 7 o'clock in the evening. I did not arrive in a rented luxury vehicle, and I walked through the towering brass double doors entirely alone. I was not wearing an extravagant, sweeping evening gown purchased specifically for the gala. I was wearing the simple, unpretentious dark navy blue linen dress. I wore absolutely no jewelry, and my face was entirely devoid of makeup. My hair was pulled back into a simple, severe style. Against the glittering, highly curated backdrop of the elite crowd, my stark, minimal appearance was a violent visual disruption. I did not have to say a single word for the atmosphere to shift. As I quietly navigated through the crowded room, the vibrant, overlapping conversations around me began to falter. Wealthy socialites and local business owners turned their heads, their champagne flutes pausing halfway to their lips. They looked at my modest attire, my bare face, and the heavy, unreadable expression I carried. Several of them recognized me immediately as the youngest daughter of the guest of honor, and a distinct, unsettling murmur began to ripple through the crowd. They could instantly sense that my presence in that specific dress carried a heavy, deeply uncomfortable weight. I looked less like a proud family member attending a celebration, and much more like a silent, mourning ghost walking through a graveyard. Sloane was standing near the towering ice sculpture at the center of the room. She was desperately attempting to resurrect her shattered public image. She wore a breathtaking, perfectly tailored white silk gown that made her look like a delicate, untouchable angel. She held a crystal glass in her hand, flashing her signature bright smile at the local press photographers, but from across the room, I could see the terrifying rigidity in her posture. Her knuckles were entirely white as she gripped the stem of her glass. For the entire first hour of the evening, she moved frantically from group to group, aggressively keeping her back turned to wherever I was standing. She absolutely refused to make eye contact with me, terrified that looking at the sister whose future she had tried to cannibalize would cause her flawless white mask to crack right in front of the cameras. Then, the crowd parted slightly, and Meredith spotted me. She was radiating absolute triumph, dressed in a breathtaking dark emerald green gown that swept elegantly across the polished hardwood floor. When her eyes finally locked onto me standing quietly near the back wall, a massive, visible wave of relief washed over her sharp features. In her deeply arrogant mind, my arrival in such a quiet, unbothered manner was the ultimate confirmation of her victory. She genuinely believed that her aggressive legal settlement offer and her endless emotional manipulation had successfully terrified me into submission. She thought I had chosen the safety of silence to protect our family prestige. She glided across the ballroom toward me, a brilliant, entirely manufactured smile plastered across her face. She reached out, her manicured fingers grazing the fabric of my arm, and leaned in close. She signaled to a nearby photographer from the local newspaper. She whispered through gritted teeth, urging me to step forward and pull Sloane into the frame so they could capture a beautiful, heartwarming photograph of the recovered, perfectly united family. I did not move. I smoothly stepped out of her physical reach, leaving her hand hovering awkwardly in the empty air. I looked directly into her eyes and offered a polite, incredibly soft refusal. "I will not ruin the program tonight, Mother," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any underlying threat. It was the most dangerous sentence I could have possibly uttered. The carefully chosen words acted as the ultimate sedative. Meredith smiled, a genuine, terrifyingly overconfident smirk touching the corners of her mouth. She nodded, thoroughly convinced that I had finally accepted my permanent place in her shadow. She turned her back to me and walked away, completely blind to the fact that she was actively marching toward the edge of a massive cliff. 10 minutes before the master of ceremonies was scheduled to take the grand stage, the ballroom lights dimmed to a soft, romantic glow. The crowd began to take their assigned seats. Meredith suddenly appeared at my side again. She firmly grabbed my elbow and pulled me out of the main hall, dragging me into a quiet, dimly lit, heavily carpeted corridor just outside the grand doors. The muffled sounds of clinking silverware and overlapping chatter echoed through the thick wooden panels. She dropped the warm, maternal facade entirely. The harsh, calculating predator stepped out from behind the emerald gown. She backed me against the ornate wallpaper and delivered her final, desperate attempt at psychological control. She leaned in so close I could smell the sharp, intoxicating scent of her expensive perfume. She commanded me to sit in my designated chair and keep my mouth completely shut. She aggressively stated that if I had even a single ounce of love, respect, or gratitude left in my body for the people who had kept a roof over my head for 18 years, I would not dare do anything to make a mockery of this family in front of the entire town. I did not flinch. I did not lower my gaze. I looked at the woman who had stolen my father's letters, drained my future, and actively tried to sell my life to fund a vanity project. "You are entirely mistaken," I replied, my voice dropping into a cold, lethal register that made her visibly step back. "This family became a permanent laughingstock the exact moment you assumed I would sign my entire life away just to save her." Before she could process the absolute finality in my words, the heavy brass doors swung open. A frantic event coordinator rushed out, breathlessly informing Meredith that it was time. Her name was being called. Meredith cast one last, highly uncertain glance at my face, but the intoxicating lure of the applause pulling her toward the stage was simply too strong to resist. She adjusted her diamond earrings, smoothed the front of her gown, and walked back into the blinding lights. I followed quietly behind her, remaining completely hidden in the deep shadows near the back exit doors. The master of ceremonies practically shouted her name into the microphone, and the entire Calder House ballroom erupted into a massive, deafening roar of applause. Meredith walked up the carpeted stairs to the towering center podium. The bright white spotlights tracked her every single movement. She looked absolutely majestic, a flawless picture of stoic grace and maternal devotion. She gripped the edges of the wooden podium, leaned into the microphone, and began to speak. Her speech was a sickeningly perfect masterpiece of emotional manipulation. Her voice trembled at the exact right moments. She spoke eloquently about the devastating, crushing weight of sudden grief. She painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of a young widow completely alone in the world, forced to single-handedly navigate the terrifying waters of raising 2 children without their father. But the most revolting part of her monologue came right at the grand climax. She raised her head, looking out over the sea of wealthy donors, and confidently declared that the true secret to surviving motherhood was possessing a heart with a perfectly balanced scale. She swore to the entire room that her greatest achievement in life was loving both of her beautiful daughters with an absolute, undivided, perfectly equal devotion. The audacity of the lie was so massive, so beautifully delivered, that several prominent women in the front row actually reached into their expensive purses to retrieve tissues to wipe their eyes. The entire room was captivated, fully buying into the spectacular illusion she had spent decades building. As the final, sweeping words of her speech echoed through the massive speakers, the crowd rose from their chairs in a sweeping wave. It was a standing ovation. Hundreds of people were violently clapping their hands, cheering for the most beautiful, destructive lie Meredith had ever told. Standing in the absolute back of the room, listening to the thunderous applause honoring my own executioner, I reached down and unzipped my worn canvas backpack. I pulled out the heavy, thick black leather binder containing every single piece of undeniable, verified legal evidence Grant Holloway and I had compiled. I stepped completely out of the concealing shadows. I walked past the velvet ropes. I did not run, and I did not hesitate. Moving with the slow, unstoppable, terrifying momentum of an incoming tide, I gripped the heavy dossier in my hands and began walking straight down the center aisle, directly toward the brightly lit stage. I did not run. I walked down the long, plush velvet runner dividing the massive ballroom. The thunderous standing ovation was still echoing off the crystal chandeliers, the sound so loud it physically vibrated against my chest. But as I moved closer to the brightly lit stage, the wild applause began to visibly waver. The wealthy guests sitting in the aisle seats noticed my stark navy blue dress, the heavy black leather binder tightly gripped in my hands, and the absolute, terrifying calm radiating from my posture. A sharp ripple of confusion spread rapidly through the elite crowd. The clapping thinned out piece by piece, dissolving into a tense, heavy silence that completely swallowed the grand hall. Meredith was still standing behind the polished wooden podium, her hands gracefully clasping her crystal award. When she saw me ascending the short flight of carpeted stairs, the victorious, glowing smile entirely vanished from her face. I stepped directly into the blinding white spotlight. I did not ask for her permission. I reached out and gently but firmly pulled the microphone stand toward me. I looked out over the sea of wealthy donors, local politicians, and regional journalists. I asked for exactly 1 minute of their time, my voice projecting clearly through the massive speakers, completely steady and devoid of any trembling emotion. I stated that my mother had just accepted their highest honor for loving her 2 daughters equally, and tonight I brought the official paperwork to prove the exact opposite. A collective gasp ripped through the front rows. Flashbulbs from the press cameras suddenly began to erupt, blindingly fast and incredibly bright. I did not launch into a long, emotional rant. I delivered 3 sharp, undeniable facts. I told the room that my 18th birthday was purposefully canceled, and I was deliberately isolated from my entire support system just to keep me under strict emotional control. Secondly, my designated educational trust fund was systematically drained by tens of thousands of dollars over the last 4 years to illegally finance the failing vanity projects of my older sister. And finally, I revealed that just 2 days ago, the commercial downtown property my late father left solely in my name was aggressively leveraged for a massive, fraudulent corporate loan without my legal consent. Before the shocked murmurs could escalate into a roar, the heavy brass doors at the back of the room swung open again. Grant Holloway strode down the center aisle. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying 3 thick identical copies of our master legal dossier. He moved with the terrifying, predatory grace of a man who knew he had already won the war before he even entered the room. He did not approach the stage. He walked directly to the front VIP table, reserved for the Alder Vale Civic Group executive board members and the corporate legal sponsors. He placed the heavy binders directly onto their expensive silk tablecloths. Meredith finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She lunged forward, desperately grabbing the edge of the microphone. Her knuckles turned stark white. She forced a highly strained, deeply patronizing laugh that echoed horribly through the room. She pleaded to the audience, her voice dripping with fake, desperate maternal concern. She claimed that her youngest daughter was deeply traumatized. She tried to convince the entire region that I was simply a confused, hurting child who had entirely misunderstood a series of complex household financial decisions. I did not let her control the narrative for a single second. I opened my binder, bypassing the bank statements and the forged county records. I pulled out the fragile, sawined piece of paper written in familiar, slanted handwriting. I replied loudly, holding the paper up under the stage lights, stating that this was not a misunderstanding. I declared it was a direct letter from my late father, hidden from me for 5 long years. I read his exact words to the silent, captive audience. The letter stated that this portion of the estate was secured so that Joyce never had to ask anyone for permission for her own future. The absolute, undeniable proof of my father and his protective intent hung heavy in the air. The crowd was completely stunned, but the final, lethal blow did not come from me, and it did not come from my lawyer. It came from the exact center of the ballroom. Sloane had been standing near the towering ice sculpture, watching her entire carefully curated world violently burned down in front of the regional press. The sheer, crushing pressure of hundreds of judgmental eyes shifting from the stage directly to her pristine white gown finally broke her fragile mind. She dropped her crystal glass. It shattered loudly against the hardwood floor. She suddenly blurted out that our mother promised I would yield like always. Her voice was a shrill, panicked shriek that cut through the entire room like a jagged knife. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Meredith on the stage. Sloane screamed that our mother promised everything would be fine, and that I would just sign the papers and give them the building. That single, pathetic outburst completely decimated Meredith. Her final, desperate defense was shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. It was the ultimate, devastating irony. The very child she had ruined my life to protect was the exact person who publicly confirmed my truth. Sloane had just confessed to the entire town that the financial fraud was absolutely real. Meredith stepped back from the podium, her mouth opening and closing silently. The Aldervale Civic Group Board president immediately stood up from the VIP table, looking utterly horrified after glancing at the first page of the legal dossier Grant had delivered. He grabbed a secondary microphone and quickly announced that the award ceremony was officially suspended and that Meredith was temporarily stripped of all community advisory roles pending a full, uncompromising legal investigation. At that exact same moment, the lead representative from the private equity firm backing Sable House Studio abruptly stood up, threw his expensive linen napkin onto the table, and walked out the back doors, officially pulling his massive financial investment right there in the dark. The ensuing legal battle over the next several weeks was a swift, merciless execution of justice. Grant Holloway was absolutely relentless. He successfully petitioned the regional superior court judge to immediately appoint an aggressive, independent third-party receiver to completely seize and manage the downtown commercial property. All associated bank accounts were permanently frozen, locking Meredith and Sloane entirely out of the revenue stream they had desperately relied upon. I successfully retained absolute legal control over my rightful assets. With the legally recovered capital from my stabilized educational trust, I proudly paid my own tuition in full and officially enrolled in a highly competitive university business administration program located 3 hours away from the coast. I signed a long-term lease for a small, sunlit apartment located right on the edge of the campus, completely severing my physical ties to Wren Harbor. I never once returned to that suffocating, perfectly manicured suburban house. On the morning I packed my final bags to leave for university, I stood on a small hill overlooking their neighborhood. I looked down at the dark roof of the home where I had spent 18 years feeling entirely invisible and utterly worthless. I watched from afar as every single thing they had built using my stolen resources, their fake prestige, their hollow businesses, and their deeply toxic social standing, slowly and inevitably crumbled into dust. For the absolute first time in my entire existence, I was no longer the forgotten child left behind to patiently clean up their endless wreckage. I was the only person walking completely away from the ruins, carrying my entire unbroken future right in my own hands. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would absolutely love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Please remember to subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people around the world.